So here's the deal. Everyone can play retro games now on phones, PCs, little handheld thingies. The barrier to entry has just been completely eliminated. In this video, I'm going to point out some weird, interesting games that I think are worth booting up and checking out. Now, they might have a few hiccups, but I think that they're neat for one reason or another. I often think that interesting is, well, more interesting than strictly good, if you know what I mean. And I've got a real mix of games here, so if one doesn't really hit the spot for you, maybe the next one will. So stick around and maybe you'll find the perfect game for you. And yeah, just a reminder, you can basically play these on anything. So just get familiar with your favorite search engine, and I'm sure you can find a guide that'll walk you through getting these up and running. First up is a survival horror game on the Sega Saturn called Deep Fear. It was released in 1998, right as the Saturn was winding down in the West, which led to it never releasing in North America. But to cut to the chase, this was obviously a response to Resident Evil, but that's not really all it was. Deep Fear is set in a claustrophobic underwater research station called the Big Table, and the story starts with a mysterious space capsule that has been long thought lost, but it crashes nearby in the Pacific. And as you probably could guess, it brings an infection with it that turns the crew into horrible mutants. You play as an ex-Navy SEAL who has to figure out what's going on and how to survive this mysterious plague. The underwater setting immediately sets it apart from Resident Evil's zombie outbreaks and creepy houses. Where Resident Evil was inspired by Romero's Dead series and Sweet Home, Deep Fear took an inspiration from films like The Abyss and The Thing. And that means that it leans more into the suffocating isolation that would be evoked from a location like this. That said though, it's not all serious. The voice acting here is totally absurd and bad in the best way possible.
Whoa, your boyfriend? Just kidding.
But for the actual gameplay itself, it sticks to the survival horror blueprint with exploration, item hunting, and puzzle solving. But there are a few changes that make this more distinct, like the ability to move and shoot at the same time, and since the Saturn had an optional analog controller, it had support for it with analog movement. Overall, the game is much more action-focused as well, giving you a dedicated grenade button and a lot more ammo than the typical survival horror game, so you can get away with spraying and praying a lot more here. But the biggest thing here that sets this game apart is its oxygen management system. Each area has a limited air supply that depletes over time, and it depletes even more when you're firing your weapon. So you'll need to find air terminals to refill, and that adds a constant sense of pressure. Deep Fear is a game that probably didn't impress at its time, but now its look has its own charm to it, with polygonal characters superimposed on pre-rendered backgrounds. The soundtrack is also composed by Kenji Kawai, who's really known for his iconic work on Ghost in the Shell.
What is this?
The creature cell is transforming into the mouse cell at an unbelievable speed.
Transforming?
Right.
If you're a fan of retro survival horror and you're looking for something a bit different, this is worth at least booting up. Just be prepared for quite a few rough edges. Next is Panzer Bandit, a PS1 side-scrolling beat-em-up that was only released in Japan. Visually, it has a great anime look to it because the character designs were done by Yoshitsune Izuna, an artist with a history of creating a ton of different designs for a bunch of different anime. But Panzer Bandit is more than just pretty. The gameplay itself is solid. It's got your standard strong and weak attacks, but the two-plane system where you can jump between the foreground and the background adds a layer to things. No pun intended. And on top of that, there's a whole combo system where you can get into some pretty satisfying juggles. Plus, each of the main characters, even the unlockable bosses, have special unique moves and super attacks. It almost feels like a simplified fighting game at times. If you're a fan of games like Guardian Heroes, you'll feel right at home here. Panzer Bandit obviously lifts a ton of inspiration from it, but paring things down to a simpler 2-lane system compared to Guardian Heroes' 3 lanes might even make it a more straightforward, easier to get into game. It's a shame that this was never officially released outside of Japan, but there are many ways to boot up a PS1 game now, so you really shouldn't miss out. You can even play co-op in the story mode or fight with up to 4 people in a versus mode. So if you're itching for a lesser-known lane-based beat-em-up, check out Panzer Bandit. Next up is a often forgotten Klonoa game for the WonderSwan, Kaze no Klonoa Moonlight Museum. Released exclusively in Japan in 1999, it yet again has you play as Namco's attempted mascot Klonoa as he makes his way through different worlds to help a crying girl whose moon has been shattered and stolen by a group of artists. The gameplay revolves around the typical Klonoa mechanics, grabbing enemies, tossing them, or using them for an upward boost. But this isn't just a simple platformer. The emphasis here is actually on puzzle solving. You'll need to collect 3 stars on each level to unlock the exit, and getting each of them can be tricky. I also just love the way this game looks. With it being a normal black and white WonderSwan game, it does do a lot to make it still look very Klonoa despite the limitations in the hardware, going as far to do stuff like parallax scrolling, something that the Game Boy could only dream about doing at the time. And on top of that, Klonoa Moonlight Museum does something unique that could only be done on the WonderSwan, and that's the ability to play the game vertically, with some stages designed to be played in this orientation. So if you're a Klonoa fan, this is a curiosity that is definitely worth seeking out. Moving on to a truly distinctive Dreamcast Zelda-style action RPG, Elemental Gimmick Gear, also known simply as Egg. This is the first game in the video that was actually released worldwide, but due to it being a Dreamcast exclusive that's hard to give a succinct pitch for, it seemingly was lost in the shuffle. Nevertheless, Egg is a special game that has a ton of neat ideas. You play as the Sleeper, who awakens after being asleep for a millennia, and in typical 90s RPG style, you have no memory of who you are. The world you awaken to has seemingly been ravaged by a cataclysm, and it's up to you and your egg-like suit of armor that you are found in, the titular Elemental Gimmick Gear, to figure out what the hell is going on. As for the presentation, imagine exploring a world made up of beautifully hand-drawn artwork in a top-down perspective, but when you face off against a boss, it transitions into a full-blown 3D battle. It's a striking way to give those encounters a real sense of scale and impact. Beyond that though, the typical gameplay has a unique flavor too. You'll be exploring ruins, solving puzzles that involve hitting switches and moving objects, you know, Zelda stuff, but when it comes to combat, there are a few odd tricks. Your primary attack is a quick punch, but you can also extend your arm for a longer reach or to grapple across gaps as you progress. You'll also get new abilities like fireballs and ice beams, but the most notable and arguably iconic thing about Egg is its spin attack. You can tuck your arms and legs in and spin to damage enemies and break through obstacles, basically turning you into a Beyblade. But you'll still need to be careful because doing this drains your health. Despite some shortcomings here and there, Elemental Gimmick Gear really is a truly unique Zelda-style game on the Dreamcast. It's one of those games that has this odd charm to it. So if you're looking for something a little bit different, definitely check out Egg. Master of Darkness was released for the Sega Master System in 1992, and it's clear to see that it was Sims and Sega's attempt to bring Castlevania to Sega consoles before Konami could do it officially later themselves with Castlevania Bloodlines. But Master of Darkness is one of those oddities that's fun to check out, regardless of how blatant it's just lifting everything from Castlevania. You play as Dr. Ferdinand Social, a parapsychologist in Victorian London, and Jack the Ripper is causing all sorts of trouble, but you suspect there's something more to what's going on beyond a few killings. And just like its inspiration, Dracula himself is behind everything. So now it's your job to take down the Master of Darkness. While the similarities here are undeniable, Master of Darkness brings his own vibe to the table too. Instead of just being locked to using a whip, you can find and use different primary weapons like a knife, a cane, or an axe, and each has its own range and power, so you'll need to choose wisely depending on the situation. There are also sub-weapons like a pistol, bombs, and a boomerang. If there's one common complaint about the early Castlevania series, it was just how rigid the movement was. But in Master of Darkness, the controls are much more responsive here, allowing for a lot more agile jumps. Visually, while it's still an 8-bit game, it looks fantastic for what it's doing. The environments are detailed and add atmosphere as you explore. If there's one major downgrade in comparison to Castlevania, it's the music. And it would be shocking, really, if it could compete in that department, but you know, while it is obviously a clone, Master of Darkness takes the core mechanics of Castlevania and does just enough to make it stand out in its own way. That said, if you're a fan of classic Castlevania, this is one that definitely deserves a look. Alright, moving on to a Dreamcast game that has a small but dedicated group of fans. Originally released in arcades as Gun Spike, Canon Spike is what happens when you take a bunch of Capcom characters from their own major franchises and strap roller skates and hoverboards to their feet and hand them a gun. It's a top-down shooter where you get to choose from Mega Man, Cammy and Charlie from Street Fighter, Arthur out of Ghosts and Goblins, BB Hood from Darkstalkers, or even a few original characters to fight off waves of robots in an uprising. The story here isn't deep, but seeing these characters team up in this way is really the main attraction. The gameplay is about staying agile as you glide around and blast everything in sight. You get your standard kind of shots, a melee for close encounters, and special ranged moves for crowd control. Think of this as the Dreamcast era's take on something like Smash TV. And I think that this is a good entry point into the bullet hell genre due to its familiar faces and slightly forgiving difficulty compared to the other games in the genre. And if that sounds good to you, Canon Spike delivers exactly what it sets out to do. Because of its arcade structure, it's a short playthrough, but it's a really fun one to do multiple times with different characters, especially in co-op. So if you're after a unique bullet hell top-down shooter that throws in some fun Capcom cameos, give Canon Spike a look. Next up is Ghost Chaser Densei, a Super Famicom beat-em-up from 1994 that never left Japan. If you're into side-scrolling brawlers, you know that the SNES had plenty of them, like the Final Fight games or Turtles in Time. And this game here fits right in with those, but brings some of its own ideas as well. At first glance, it's the standard stuff. Walk to the right, punch dudes, fight a boss, you get your attack and your jump buttons, but where it shakes things up is its special move system. Instead of draining your health like a lot of other belt scrollers of this era, specials use a dedicated meter. And it's a meter that refills on its own when you stand still, or even a bit as you take a few hits. So it's the game's way of balancing things out if you're taking a beating. And since you're not exchanging your health for powerful attacks, it really encourages you to use your supers more often, which ends up leading to a lot more over-the-top chaos. But it's not just the specials, the basic combat also has a lot more going on here than a lot of other 16-bit brawlers. You can time blocks for counterattacks, and you can do air juggles for stringing hits together. There are 3 characters, each with unique moves, and there are even team-up attacks in co-op. So if you're like me, always looking for a quick beat-em-up to play through in an afternoon, give this one a look. Xexyz is an NES game that was released in 1990, and it's a pretty impressive mix of ideas for an NES game. It combines typical side-scrolling platforming stuff with horizontal shoot-'em-up stages. You play as Apollo in the year 2777, who's trying to save the nation of Xexyz from the mechanical Garuza. What makes Xexyz stand out is how it swaps gameplay. Every other stage is presented like a typical action platformer. You run, jump, shoot. It's not entirely dissimilar to games like Mega Man. But then on the other hand, the other set of stages switch things up, where you're put into a ship for Gradius-style side-scrolling shooting. I'd say that each section here isn't like the standout greatest in its genre, really, but being combined into one game really makes it more interesting. It's challenging as you might expect for a shmup, but with its unlimited continues, it makes things doable. If you're a fan of games on the NES that tried mixing genres, like Blaster Master or The Guardian Legend, Xexyz is worth seeking out.
See it now in 3D. Batteries not included.
The Virtual Boy is a much-hated console. Or is it a handheld? Regardless, it's justifiably shit on, in my opinion, or at least the hardware itself is. Because there are a few games that are decent enough or just odd enough to be worth checking out, especially now that you can play them in ways that are not staring directly into this terrible blood-red display. Innsmouth Manor is one of those oddities. It was released on October Friday the 13th, 1995, exclusively in Japan. And it's a first-person horror shooter drawing its name and fish-like creatures from H.P. Lovecraft's The Shadow over Innsmouth. The gameplay has you moving through the titular mansion's 45 floors in classic first-person dungeon crawler fashion. On each floor, you need to find a key and exit before the time runs out. One of the very few neat features of the Virtual Boy was its dual D-pads, which could act almost like an early version of a dual-stick control system. You use the left D-pad for movement and the right for aiming. Also, resources are scarce, making this in a way a true survival horror experience. Depending on your choice of route through the branching paths, it will lead you to one of 4 different endings. I assume with the required red and black stereoscopic 3D, it probably was a mess to look at. But booting this game up in other ways, you can adjust the palette so it's not so taxing on your eyes. And by doing so, you can finally appreciate the fun creature designs here and the sprite art that really was previously ruined by the dominant sanguine hues. This is one of the games that I wouldn't say is a great game, but I think Innsmouth Manor is an interesting piece of early first-person horror. In the Hunt is a side-scrolling shooter for the arcade, PS1, and Sega Saturn that often gets forgotten. Unlike most other side-scrolling shooters though, here you take control of a submarine. And yes, if you're wondering, this comes from the people who would later go on to spearhead the Metal Slug series. And like those, you're constantly facing chaotic battles. Here though, they're composed of battleships and mechanical sea creatures. Also, instead of many other games like this of its time, your control isn't locked into shifting up and down at a strict straight-on shootout. You have more control over your angles. You can even surface to shoot down airborne targets, and it being a submarine game at the time could have been what scared people off when it came out. I know that if you were to tell me about a submarine game without showing me any gameplay, I would just assume it would be like a tedious and boring kind of thing where you're piloting a submarine, but here it's nothing like that. Using the depth of the water to tactically avoid fire from the air feels really great, and it's really just generally super responsive. Like most games designed for the arcade, it can be a bit challenging, but nowadays you probably don't need to worry about dumping in a ton of credits to brute force your way through. If you're looking for a retro shooter that's not the usual spaceship setup, check out In the Hunt. You can even find it on modern systems through the Arcade Archive series. Namco's Numan Athletics is an arcade sports game, but it's not the typical sports game. This one's about mutant athletes in some bizarre competitions. You pick one of 4 Numans to take on these inhuman feats, and the presentation here is very anime, with bright graphics and lots of color. It has 8 off-the-wall Olympic-style events, each set in a different country. One minute you're in Russia shooting down missiles, and the next you're trying to stop a bullet train in Japan. So if you're familiar with any Olympic-style games or like track and field, you'd be pretty familiar with this general structure. You need to beat the target score for each event to move on to the next. The controls stick to a simple 3-button setup, and the game shows you how to play before each round, which is nice for these minigame compilation sorts of games. I think what makes this worth checking out is its heightened reality. It pushes things past the dullness I find common in this genre. The goofy premise is entertaining, and with up to 4 players competing at once, it can become a great local multiplayer game. And the breakbeat soundtrack by Nobuyoshi Sano adds a lot of great energy here that he would be later known for from Ridge Racer and Tekken. Thankfully, Numan Athletics is another game that's available through the Arcade Archive series. So if you want a competitive arcade game that's full of strange moments, give Numan Athletics a shot. Next up is a PlayStation game with a cult fanbase, that being Trap Gunner. It's a mix of strategy and arcade action that's most similar to like the Bomberman formula, but it has a lot of unique things that set it apart also. It's a top-down action game, but instead of just blasting away, you're setting traps to catch your opponents. The main goal, like Bomberman, is to be the last person standing, and to achieve that, you use tons of different weapons, typical guns like shotguns and pistols, but also a whole arsenal of traps, mines, and pitfalls. The guns quickly lose focus, and the traps really become where the fun is. When you start a round, you choose from several different characters, and this is where it gets interesting because each has their own skills and, most importantly, their own set of traps. Staying alive means planning your trap placements carefully, and guiding enemies into well-placed traps is just really satisfying. But to keep things more clear, there's also a trap detection mode. By holding down a button, it lets you spot hidden enemy traps. But usually it's pretty hard to find the time to do so. But if you do, disarming one gets back some of your health, and that trap type is removed from your opponent's inventory for that round, which adds some strategy to when you use each trap, and if it's worth risking it being taken away from your toolset. Just like the last game, this is another one that's best in split screen. So give Trap Gunner a look if you want to try something new next time you get together with some friends.
Trap Gunner.
Classic.
Wetrix is an N64 game that's really easy to falsely lump in with all of the other Tetris also-rans. But it isn't your standard block-dropping puzzle game. Picture a 3D isometric play area, and your job is to manage falling water by raising and lowering the topographic layout of the area. You build up walls to contain as much water as possible without filling the drain meter and ending the game. And you do that by using different uppers and downer shapes that are given to you in a really Tetris-style next queue of blocks. It's a really different spatial kind of challenge compared to the stacking that you get from Tetris. Besides the uppers to build and the downers to lower the ground, the water itself isn't static. It flows based on the shape of the terrain. It's a unique physics-based take on endless puzzle games. To spice things up and keep things less manageable, there are mines that blow holes in your dams, ice cubes that freeze water, and big land masses risk earthquakes, so you need to plan and be prepared. But you also have tools to assist you, like fireballs that evaporate waters and lakes, to score points and lower the drain meter. So if you want a puzzle game that breaks the mold, give Wetrix a look. The Firemen is a Super Nintendo game with a cult following that was developed by Human Entertainment, who's most well known for creating Clock Tower. But the Firemen is a very different kind of game. It puts you in a burning chemical factory as a fireman who needs to put out and navigate around a raging fire to save people from the blaze and stop the spread of dangerous chemicals. So the setup is a high-stakes rescue mission against the clock. It's a top-down game where you guide your firefighter through these burning rooms. And you fight the blaze with a fire hose that has two settings, a direct stream for distance and a wider spray for closer threats. But luckily, the water here is unlimited, so you don't need to worry about running out. But you also get items like fire extinguishing bombs that really help you get out of trouble. But also, you're not going in alone. An AI partner follows you and helps you out by using his axe and leading survivors out. But that might also make you think that this is playable in co-op, which it isn't, and honestly, I feel like that's a little bit of an oversight. But regardless, it's still a really impressive 16-bit game that has some really great fire tech under the hood. Each floor here ends with a confrontation against a boss of sorts. That makes things really interesting on top of the normal gameplay. If you're after a different kind of SNES action game with solid mechanics, track down the Firemen. And our final game is another Super Nintendo cult classic, this one called EVO Search for Eden. The premise here is wild and super high concept. You guide a creature through Earth's history, evolving it from a simple fish all the way to potentially becoming a human, with the goal of reaching the Garden of Eden. It mixes side-scrolling action platforming with character growth customization that's more commonly present in traditional style RPGs. The loop here involves swimming or walking through levels, fighting other creatures and eating them to earn evolution points, and you can spend them in the game's main draw, the evolution system, where you can upgrade your different parts like jaws, horns, body, tail, and changing these parts alter your stats, looks, and abilities. Like you might choose horns for ramming or improve your legs for better jumping. It's a lot like a proto version of Spore. And as you evolve through EVO's 5 different time periods, you need to keep adapting to stay competitive in the food chain. The story itself abstracts things a bit by having Gaia, the spirit of Earth, guiding you. And there are mysterious crystals that show up to mutate creatures into tough bosses that you have to take down. While the gameplay is a bit slow, especially at the start, with it basically just being a grind fest, EVO is still worth looking into because of just how different it is from any other Super Nintendo game. So if you want to follow the evolution of a creature across history, check this one out. Alright, and that wraps up my third video recommending some lesser obvious retro games that you can check out on your device of choice. I really love discovering these kind of little secret hidden gem sort of games. If you have any more that you think I should include in future videos, leave those in the comments below. It really does help out a ton. And yeah, if you enjoyed this video, check out my other ones that I've done just like this, if you haven't seen those before, and do all the YouTubey stuff, like, subscribe, share. I really do appreciate it so much. Yeah, I tried something a little bit different with this video. I like hyper scripted it, and I know it definitely reads and sounds very scripted, but hopefully that's not too irritating. And I know the microphone might be a little weird still. I have a new setup and I'm trying to orient everything and figure out stuff, so it might still be a little muddy and a little echoey, so apologies for that stuff. But yeah, anyway, thank you guys so much for watching.